Okay, so I believe we are going. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for IMT's webinar on assessing the impacts of benchmarking and transparency policies in cities. This is the first webinar in a series of 2 that we're hosting that is surrounding IMT's putting data to work toolkit. Our second webinar, How Cities Building Performance Policies Create Energy Efficiency Data that Utilities Can Use, will be hosted on Wednesday, August 8th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. A quick few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and we will be distributing that recording to all attendees either today or tomorrow after the webinar is recorded. All attendee lines are muted for this webinar to minimize audio interference. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the speakers, please submit them through the questions option in the webinar control panel that you have in front of you. We'll collect all of those, and at the end of the webinar, we'll have a quick Q&A session, and we'll get to as many as we can during that time. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, you can send us an email at imtweb@imt.org if you'd like to follow up on those. And with that, I will turn things over to today's moderator, IMT's Jayson Antonoff, who will get things going and introduce today's speakers.
Great, thank you, Chris. This is Jayson Antonoff. I'm the Associate Technical Director for IMT. I want to welcome you all to the webinar. Good afternoon, good morning to those of you on the West Coast. And we're really glad to have you here. I think this is going to be a great discussion, great presentation. We've gotten a very good response to people signing up for this webinar. So it's obviously a topic that's generating a lot of interest amongst people. A couple of words about IMT first before we get started. IMT, Institute for Market Transformation, is a DC-based nonprofit, and our mission is to catalyze widespread and sustained demand for high-performing buildings. We do that by working with both public and private sector parties. On the private sector side, we work with businesses, both small and large, as well as landlords and tenants, to address the barriers presented in energy efficiency implementation. And then on the public side, which is where I primarily work, we support city, county, and state government bodies to help them develop policies and other supporting programs that will increase energy efficiency. So I've had the opportunity to work with about 30 different state and local governments to help them getting their appropriate frameworks in place to support energy efficiency. On today's webinar, we're going to be discussing the impacts that cities are achieving through building benchmarking policies and other related but also data-driven policies. We'll be looking specifically at some examples of how cities are working with and analyzing the data they're collecting in order to assess if the results are being achieved. We'll also look at some of the insights that cities are beginning to unearth by looking at that data. And then we'll talk about some of the longer-term impacts that cities expect to see from these policies. So before we dive into the impact of benchmarking and transparency policies, let's start by reviewing what a benchmarking and transparency policy is and what they are intended to achieve. These policies were really designed to make information about how buildings are performing more readily available both to building owners and to the real estate market. Before cities began enacting these kinds of policies, beginning in about 2011, it was actually quite difficult for building owners to know how the performance of their building compared to that of local peer buildings, or for the market to identify which buildings were performing significantly better or worse than others. So these policies are really changing that dynamic. Quick review of how they work. Typically, building owners will benchmark their own buildings so they can understand how it's working, how that is changing over time. They will report those results to a local government, typically city government, or there's a few states, such as the state of California, and that information allows those local governments to use that data more effectively, understand which market sectors to target, how to allocate the very scarce funds that governments typically have, and really support activities that will drive energy efficiency improvements. The next step is transparency, which is sharing that information with the public at large so that real estate actors anybody looking to invest in a property, to lease a property, to finance a transaction, can at least take energy efficiency information into account, and thereby creating a higher demand for the buildings that are performing well. And then there's a feedback loop whereby, because there's demand for those buildings, that spurs the owners to take additional steps to improve energy efficiency. So all of those actions work together to drive market transformation and to really build a robust market for energy efficiency. We're seeing quite a bit of uptake in these types of policies. At last count, there were about 26 cities and states that now have benchmarking policies that include provisions for private sector buildings, and it covers about 11 billion square feet, billion with a B. So there's a lot of real estate that is now being covered by these kinds of policies. We're also seeing cities that are going beyond benchmarking. You can see some of the colored dots on this map, the purple and green, and those are cities that have adopted additional measures such as mandatory audit or retuning requirements for buildings that are low performers. And that really allows them to more directly drive the actions that will achieve energy savings and also collect more granulated data about the specific systems and equipment in each building. That's information that can be correlated to the data on how the buildings are performing, and really gives city government a chance to have some great insights into the systems, the condition of those systems, and how that relates to the energy use for the buildings that are typical within their market. What we're seeing now is that the cities that have these kinds of policies are really observing significant improvements in the energy efficiency of those buildings that are subject to these requirements. So you can see there's some variation in the numbers, but typically over the course of a few years, cities are achieving from 6 to more than 14% improvement. So there's really, it's hard to say if benchmarking is the direct contributor to this. And there certainly are other activities that are happening in these cities, but the clear evidence thus far is that cities that do have benchmarking programs are seeing significant improvements in those buildings that are subject to these requirements. So now that the policies have been in place for several years, we wanted to take this opportunity to go back to some of the cities that have policies in place and really understand what kinds of results they're seeing. So the questions that we want to explore today are, how are cities working with the data that they collect to evaluate the impacts of their efforts? This is clearly self-reported data. It's data based on building stock that is changing year over year. So you really have to understand how to analyze that data and use it in such a way that you can discern the changes over time and really evaluate the trends in energy performance and other attributes. We want to understand some of the insights that cities are gaining from mining this data. So it's not just benchmarking data, but also looking at other activities that are going on, audits and other sources of data that are coming together with benchmarking to really give them a much richer insight into what's going on with those buildings. And then finally, we want to understand the breadth of total impacts that cities can expect to achieve. The previous slide I showed you was based on the energy savings. There's lots of other things that are happening as a result of these policies, and we'll hear more about those later on. As Chris mentioned, this work is part of a project that IMT did with funding from the DOE under our Putting Data to Work, creating a Putting Data to Work toolkit. This was a 3-year project where we really examined how the data that's being generated by benchmarking laws can and is being used by cities, by energy efficiency providers, by utilities and building owners. We've got a wealth of resources that are on our website at the link on the screen here, everything from high-level reports and guidance documents to more toolkit type resources, things like an implementation assessment guide, some outreach strategies, things like that. And then quite a few case studies, a couple of examples of which you can see on the screen here for Clean Energy DC and for the New York City Retrofit Accelerator. So if you haven't already looked at some of the resources in our Putting Data to Work toolkit, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at that. And then also, as Chris mentioned, we do have another webinar coming up in a few weeks which is more oriented toward utilities and utility program administrators and how they can use these building performance policies to really create some programs that work effectively for them. So with that, let me introduce the speakers that we're going to have for today's session. The first speaker that you're going to hear is Katie Bergfeld with the Department of Energy and Environment in Washington, D.C. She's a program specialist there, and she manages the district's energy benchmarking program. In that capacity, she's overseeing their help center. She supervises all the enforcement activities with regard to benchmarking laws and directs the data analysis and evaluation. So really looking at all the data that's coming in and trying to make some sense out of it and help the city use that information in effective ways. Prior to joining DDOE, she worked as a program specialist with the USGBC, and there she was responsible for managing the production metrics for the LEED certification program there. And before that, which is something I just learned recently, she was also a decorated collegiate athlete, and she received awards both in basketball and track and field while she was at Emory. After Katie, we'll hear from Ross McQuinney. Ross has been with the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability for about 3.5 years and has been very involved with the development of many of the programs there. He's helped develop some of the new legislation that they've had recently, where they've expanded the breadth of their benchmarking programs to increase the effectiveness of the greener, greater buildings plan. And he's also worked a lot with the analytic projects they have there, looking at their annual benchmarking reports and their audit data. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Matt Cox. Matt is the co-founder and CEO of the Greenlink Group, which is a clean energy technology and consulting firm based in Atlanta. In this role, Matt oversees the design of energy and resource analysis software tools that help inform planning and policy decisions across the US. They're really designed to increase the precision of the projections that people are making on energy efficiency strategies and their impact, and also how to capitalize on those opportunities to improve business and social outcomes. His research has helped to inform evidence-based energy policy and design work at the local, state, national, and even international levels. And some of the policy recommendations that he's helped inform have been adopted by several cities and states that we've worked with as well at IMT, as well as the US government and 12 other nations. And prior to the Greenlink Group, Matt was the Building Energy Efficiency Program Manager for the City of Atlanta. So he's actually got a really good perspective on the city side of things inside the beast to understand what it takes to push these policies forward. So with that, let me turn it over to our first speaker, Katie Bergfeld from DC, and we'll hear about how they're working with the data in Washington, DC.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay, guess I wouldn't know because you're all muted. Thanks, Jayson. Thanks for that great introduction. You actually made me laugh out loud mentioning my collegiate athletic career. Anyway, my name is Katie Bergfeld. I work for the Department of Energy and Environment for the government of the District of Columbia. And today I'm going to be talking about basically how we use the benchmarking data that we receive, what we do with it, and basically some basic information on how we sort of clean that data up so that we can prime it for use. Okay, there we go. So to give you just a bit of context of how we operate here in the district in terms of our climate and energy goals, we all operate under the Sustainable DC initiative, which basically says that in just one generation, DC will be the healthiest, greenest, and most livable city in the United States. And in practical terms, that means that by 2050, we will have a reduction in GHG emissions by 50% by 2032, and 80% by 2050. We'll have a reduction in district-wide energy use by 50% by 2032. And then we're aiming to have an increase in the use of renewable energy to make up 50% of the district's energy supply by 2032. So these are the goals that we operate under in terms of our benchmarking program, our green building programs, and all of our transportation programs. to give you also a bit of context on our benchmarking law, so our benchmarking law was passed under the Clean and Affordable Energy Act of 2008. We were the first municipality in the country to pass one of these laws. We were not the first to implement, sadly, but we were the first to pass one of these laws. And our law applies to privately owned buildings over 50,000 square feet. That includes commercial and multifamily. It also applies to our DC-owned properties over 10,000 square feet. We do not cover any of the federal buildings. A lot of people ask us that question because we are in DC. Our law does not apply to the federal buildings. These are all just DC-owned offices, schools, libraries, fire stations, things like that. The law was adopted in 2008 and the implementing regulations were finalized in 2013. So we currently have 6 to 7 years of data on a lot of our larger buildings, which is a pretty good, I would say a pretty good stock of building data to have. And then our benchmarking data is disclosed beginning in the second year of reporting. So if a building had to start reporting in 2010, we would get that data in 2010, and then we wouldn't actually publicly disclose it we wouldn't publicly disclose their data until they reported for 2011. Just as an example. All of it is done through Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and there's also a target finder component in our law, but I'm not going to talk much about that today. So again, as I said, we've been collecting data since April 1st of 2013. We collect this data annually from all of our buildings, and then we take that data and we basically want to prime it in order to sort of clean it out, for public disclosure purposes, B, for data analysis purposes, so that we can actually make sure that the data we're looking at is somewhat accurate and complete, and C, for enforcement purposes. Our law states that all of the data must be complete and accurate, so we want to make sure that we're checking the data to see that that is true. So the data that you're seeing here, this is an example of a spreadsheet. We basically take the data, we run it through a bunch of formulas and a spreadsheet, and then we have a bunch of alerts that pop up if the data is missing information. So for example, you can see at the bottom, we check for completeness. If there is no site EUI or it's zero, weather normalized source EUI, is not available or zero. If there's no electricity usage, because every building in the district consumes electricity, total water usage is not there, and if the metered areas do not, or we check to make sure that the metered areas equal whole building. If any of those things are not true, we actually reject the report, and we make the person who submitted it fix it. Furthermore, we also check, we do a few checks for accuracy. One sector that we know has sort of some misunderstandings about how the law applies to the buildings is multifamily. A lot of multifamily building owners don't understand that the law is a whole building requirement, which means that if their individual residential units are separately metered, they still have to provide that data. Both of our utility providers, both electric and natural gas, provide whole building aggregate data here in the district. So the building owner would be required to go gather the meter numbers for the entire property and then get that information in aggregates. They don't have to go around to each individual resident and ask them for the data, but they do have to get that aggregate whole building data in order to be considered compliant. So we've noticed that this is an issue with multifamily owners specifically. So any built multifamily properties that have an Energy Star score above 95, or their total electricity usage is below 15%. We've done some data analysis in the past to show us that typically buildings, electricity makes up at least 15% of their energy mix. If either of those metrics turn out to be true, we actually send an email and tell the building owner, we don't think you're providing whole building data. You need to go and get it, and you need to fix your data and resubmit it. And then the last thing that we check, the scores. We actually did a data analysis project with NYU 3 years ago, where they developed a algorithm where we run all of our reports through the algorithm, and then it basically does a statistical analysis and gives us a grade for each report. So each report gets an A, B, C, D, A, B, C, or D. And so based on that grading scale, we have used that in the past to go back to people and say, your report was run through our analysis. We believe there's data quality issues. Please share your data with us directly in Portfolio Manager so that we can look at it. So that's another way that we check for accuracy. And we're doing that currently through an Excel sheet, but we're actually moving on to trying to move this into a more sophisticated database. I'm not sure if everybody on the phone is familiar with SEED, but SEED is the Standard Energy Efficiency Database Platform, which is a project of US DOE and NREL. And basically they are trying to develop a standard database where cities or other folks that are collecting data like this can actually manage their data, can do these data quality checks that we're doing somewhat manually through Excel, as well as share the data. And so this is a project of US DOE, as I mentioned, and currently DC has our calendar year 2014 and 2017 data in SEED, and we are using it progressively, sort of moving all of our current database into this database. And so these are just some of the data quality checks that we do within SEED. This is a very hard slide to read, I understand, but I just wanted to show you kind of the breadth of all of the data quality checks that we're doing. You can see here at the top, we're looking to see if the Energy Star score is below a certain number or above a certain number, because that probably means it's an outlier and there may be data quality issues. We check to see if the site EUI or the weather normalized source EUI is within a certain range. And what SEED allows you to do is to not only make those checks, but then over on the right-hand side, you'll see all our colorful labels. You can make labels based on that field. So if anything has a site EUI below 30, for example, we could mark that as low EUI. And then we could pull a list of all the folks that have a low EUI. We could contact them and say, we think that you're not providing whole building data. So our eventual plan is to be able to move all of this into SEED, to be doing everything that we do in Excel within SEED, label the data, follow up on submissions, pull reports, things like that. So we're working on getting to that point, and it's just a little bit more sophistication that we can do within the SEED database. Some of the things that we do also to clean up this data, we have a green building report that's put out by our Urban Sustainability Administration every year. Basically, we take all the data for the years that we're looking at. We throw out anything that has no weather normalized site EUI, and then we throw out anything that has more than a 40% change in weather normalized site EUI in a given year. So if a building's site EUI went down by 40% between 2013 and 2014, we throw that data out because we just believe that that's probably not accurate. There's probably something going on with that report. So we take that out. And then we do an analysis both of our private buildings and our public buildings. Right here on the slide, you can see the analysis we did for the 2013 to 2016 data for the weather normalized site UI for our private buildings overall, and then for our office buildings specifically. And with our private buildings, we were able to see that there was a 4.5% decrease over that 4-year period. With our office buildings, there was almost a 6% decrease. So this is something that we do every year. We provide it to our Urban Sustainability Administration to be published in our Green Building Report. We also, after we do a lot of cleaning and enforcement and make sure that people are submitting data to us, we then publicly disclose that information both as a spreadsheet on our website, and then we also have this handy dandy interactive mapping tool that we launched last year. So we do a lot of data cleansing to get to this point where we can put it in our map and make sure that it is readily available for public consumption. To go further past just kind of publishing the data and doing analysis, we also have several projects that we've used the benchmarking data for that I want to go through. I'm going to go through 3 main ones that we've done in the past couple years. The first is our Clean Energy DC plan. Clean Energy DC is basically our roadmap to how we are going to meet our climate and energy targets, the ones that I mentioned at the beginning that showed our 50% reduction by 2032. So that's basically our vision. And then Clean Energy DC is our roadmap of how we're going to get there. This plan was released as a draft last year. It's currently being finalized, and hopefully the final report will be coming out very soon, like hopefully within the next week. There are 57 actions across 4 areas, which includes equity, buildings, energy supply system, and transportation. So all of this was basically modeled by a contractor that we worked with to model this plan for us to help us figure out how we're going to meet our climate and energy goals. And the way that the benchmarking data kind of rolls into that is we used our benchmarking data to go into the modeling for Clean Energy DC. You can see over on, this is a very complicated chart. You don't need to memorize these numbers, obviously. But you can see over on the left-hand side just how much of the data analysis actually came from our benchmarking data. At the top, we got the low-rise residential information from the Energy Information Administration. And then we got down at the bottom, you can see we got data directly from DC Water and GSA. But for the rest of the buildings, our institutional, government, our private, commercial, and industrial, that all came from the benchmarking data. And we were able to kind of analyze the average site EUIs by fuel type, and then basically estimate what the site energy consumption was for those property types. And so basically, we were able to take that data and then come up with charts like this. So basically what this chart shows us is that by taking actions in these different categories, these are the GHG emission reductions that we can see over the next several years. So this is all based on a model that was done by our contractor, Integral Group. And they were able to take, like I said, things that were within our benchmarking data, build a model, and then show us specific actions and specific areas that we can take action within to reduce our GHG emissions and meet our eventual climate and energy goals. The next project I want to mention is actually, Jayson sort of mentioned it in his introduction, is our Putting Data to Work, the Putting Data to Work project. And before I go into that, I just quickly want to explain what the DC Sustainable Energy Utility is, because they are the entity that worked with IMT on that project. So DCSEU is a third-party demand-side management program administrator. They basically operate under contract to DOE to offer energy efficiency incentives to district utility customers. They offer incentives for both electricity, gas, renewable energy, to promote green jobs. They do a lot of work investing in the low-income community, and then they do a lot of work with leveraged funds. The same law that established our benchmarking law also established the DCSEU, and you can see some of the performance targets here that SEU is contractually obligated to meet under all these different categories. So working with DCSEU and IMT, IMT had a project called Putting Data to Work. It was a US DOE funded grant, and they worked with SEU to basically leverage the benchmarking data in order to incorporate it into their everyday work. So you can see here, this is an example of what SEU was able to build out using the benchmarking data. They have a lot of account managers over at SEU that are talking to customers and trying to figure out what can we go do in your building to make it more efficient. This is just an example, American University. This is data that they were able to glean from the benchmarking data and put it into a usable dashboard that not only the account managers can use, but they can show to the customer very quickly and say, this is your energy use, this is your energy use over time, these are the different buildings within your portfolio. Basically take the benchmarking data and make it very relevant and real for their customers. This is another example of what they were able to do. This is their new tracker tool. They have a new tool that they use that they're calling Tracker. And basically what they're doing, again, with that tool is they're able to track a building and see what its energy use is over time. They can track any actions that they're doing in the building. So let's say they did a lighting upgrade. They could go under and say, okay, under sites and measures, we did a lighting upgrade in June of 2018, and then they could be able to track, what was the energy usage in that building after that upgrade was made. So this is just a really impressive product that came out of that project with IMT from the grant from USDOE. Lastly, in thinking forward past our benchmarking law, we've been thinking a lot lately about what's next. And one of the things that DC has been thinking about over the last year or so is passing some sort of performance standard for our buildings. And just actually last week or 2 weeks ago, our DC Council actually released a proposed legislation from Councilmember Che's office with provisions for a building energy performance standard within the district. It's a proposed legislation right now, so it's nothing finalized. But last year, DOEE started thinking that this was something that the district needed to do. We needed to start putting some standards on our buildings that they had to meet. This had to be more than just a reporting requirement. And so we took advantage of some free technical assistance from C40 Cities and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And what they were able to do is basically take our benchmarking data, and they were able to do some categorization. As you can see here in this chart, they categorized everything by building type. Those are the different colors on the right-hand side. And then they were basically able to tell us what would be the energy reduction needed for each sector in order to meet a certain standard. So if, for example, along the axis on the bottom, you can see if the buildings had to meet the 20th percentile Energy Star score in the district for that building type, this is how much energy reduction they'd have to see, all the way up to the 50th percentile. So they took our benchmarking data and they said if all the office buildings had to meet the 50th percentile Energy Star score for offices in the district, this is how much energy reduction they would have to see. And so they were able to create charts for us like this. And not only that, but they were able to leverage some cost data from DCSEU to give us charts like this. And so here you can see that they were able to take the cost data, they were able to take the energy reduction targets that each building would have to meet, and they were able to come up with a simple payback for each sort of building type, and if they, based on what percentile of Energy Star score they would have to meet. So with education, for example, if buildings had to meet the median score for education facilities in the district, the cost of having to do those measures within their building to increase their energy efficiency, they'd still see a payback of less than 3 years. So this for us was some pretty powerful data that we're going to be able to have on hand as this legislation moves through committee. We're going to be able to have the data that we need to say that this is a good thing, and if you think that this is going to cost too much money, we can provide you with data to show you sort of what we see as we've done some modeling to see what the payback would be on putting some of these energy efficiency measures in your building. So that's pretty much all that I have to talk about. I don't know if we want to do questions now or later, but here's my contact information if you need any of it, and that's it.
Great, thanks, Katie. I think we're going to hold off on questions for right now. We'll shift on over to Ross McWhinney and hear about New York City, what's been going on there. Again, I encourage you to send your questions in via there was a question tab. I know some of you have been sending questions in under the chat tab. We'll monitor both of those, but we will try to set aside 10 minutes at the end to respond to some questions. Also, there's been one question that's come through consistently. I don't know if we mentioned this at the beginning, but you will have access to the recording. This is being recorded, and we'll be sending out all the slides and everything after the webinar, so no need to worry about that. Great. And Ross, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jayson. Thanks for inviting me. So again, my name's Ross McWhinney. I'm a senior policy advisor here in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability in New York City. I manage the city's greenhouse gas inventory, and I work on policy development in our buildings team, largely focused around data and data access and analysis. So I'm going to talk about how New York City uses data from our benchmarking, our energy audit, and other sources to gain new insights into how our buildings perform, what we can do to make them more efficient, and how we can reach our climate reduction goals. Let's see, next slide, great. So I'm going to cover analysis of a few data sets here. So these include our energy benchmarking data, which covers over 2 billion square feet of real estate and we're scheduled to extend that down to 25,000 square feet, hopefully in the coming months. Our energy audit report data, which lists energy system inventory, as well as recommended energy conservation measures for our largest buildings. Our greenhouse gas inventory data, which is citywide energy consumption and emissions on an annual basis. And finally, the last, very commonly used data set in our analysis is the Pluto data set, the property land use tax lot output, which is a really great resource and shows things like building type, size, age, zoning, assessed value, and many other factors from our Department of Finance. And so, these 4 data sets in particular were used a few years back in our Buildings Technical Working Group, which was about a year-long stakeholder process, very intensive, included experts from the real estate, architecture, engineering, labor, academic, affordable housing, and environmental advocacy worlds, essentially. And we all kind of basically had these meetings throughout the year where they reflected on an analysis being performed on these data sets, and that continues to be a really great resource. So I'm going to present some of the findings and the rationale behind how those findings got us to different policies and programs. So our really main driving mandate here is to cut greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050 from our 2005 base year. This is the goal that Mayor de Blasio committed to in 2014, and it's the level that the IPCC says developed countries need to reach at least this level to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So far, we're observing about a 15% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions since 2005. We believe that this reduction has come primarily from the shift from coal to natural gas in electricity generation, which is, part of the broader shale gas mega trend, I guess, in this time period. So looking at our sectors in the inventory, it's clear that buildings are our largest source of emissions. They contribute, 68% of emissions citywide, and this means it's our largest driver, but also our largest opportunity to reduce emissions. We also expect, based on historic construction rates, that 90% of our buildings today will still be standing in 2050. So we're not going to be able to build our way out of this. We're going to have to consider retrofits in existing buildings if we want to reach our 80 by 50 goal. So combining our tax lot data and our inventory data allows us to understand the distribution of building types in terms of count of buildings, gross floor area, and greenhouse gas emissions. So while when we look at building count, it looks like 1 to 4 family is certainly our most prevalent. There's over 800,000 1 to 4 family homes out of our million+ buildings. But the largest buildings in terms of square footage and then in terms of greenhouse gas emissions are actually our multifamily and our commercial buildings. This analysis also shows us that our commercial, our industrial, and our institutional buildings have higher emissions per square foot than the residential spaces do. And so we also use our tax lot data to split our building stock into 22 key building typologies. These are based on building use type, their age, their height. And this categorization has allowed us to develop strategies that are more specific to the many types of buildings we find here. They've allowed us to model different representative typologies and consider retrofit paths for each of those typologies. So looking at our benchmarking data gives us a view of the variability or the variation in energy use intensity across different building types. We see that energy use intensity varies greatly among commercial, industrial, and hospital buildings, while residential and schools have a more predictable energy consumption profile. Our inventory tells us that over 56% of our building-based emissions come from the on-site combustion of fossil fuels. And this is a pretty important observation. This means that even if we had a 100% renewable grid today, we wouldn't be able to reach our 80 by 50 goals without significantly reducing our on-site combustion of natural gas and heating oil in our buildings. And so the end use breakdowns that come from our energy audit data show us that this on-site combustion of fossil fuels, perhaps not surprisingly, is driven by heating and hot water demand. We also realize from this that the multifamily sector is our largest driver of that heating and hot water demand. Now this one's kind of busy. I guess I'd say look at the red blocks that I've tried to outline in dashed lines here. This basically is a reflection of our equipment inventory portion of our audit data, and it shows us that a little further into this question or this line of reasoning that 70% of our large buildings have steam heating systems, and that this penetration is even higher or especially high in our multifamily buildings. And so the energy consumption from those audits, that data shows us that the multifamily buildings with steam systems use more energy for heating than those with hydronic systems. And then within those steam system buildings, the one pipe systems use more energy for heating than those with two pipe systems. So we also know that there's a lot of room to improve the performance of heating systems due to this wide variation of energy use intensity that we're observing between system types. So, to kind of summarize these conclusions that we're taking from this analysis, we know that we need to reduce energy consumption in heating and hot water through a range of methods, through retrocommissioning, through improving operations and maintenance, through improving building envelope, through building envelope measures. But we also know that we need to consider and support beneficial electrification of heating and hot water with 80 by 50 in mind. So these kind of realizations around steam heating led us to the development of the Better Steam Heat campaign, which is implemented through our Retrofit Accelerator program. This is essentially an energy efficiency coaching program, the accelerator that is, which helps building owners understand their options to fix their building's steam heating systems in this instance, and connects them with contractors trained by the city to make improvements, helps them find incentives to help pay for the cost of the work to upgrade their systems, and to calibrate them, and it trains building staff to keep systems in working order. Now back to this systems inventory view, now looking at cooling. The audit data shows us that more than 90% of our large buildings have non-central cooling systems, and this is somewhat unique to New York City due to some fire code regulations, from what I understand. So the most common cooling systems observed included window AC units, through-wall AC units, and PTAC, or package terminal AC units, all of which are typically poorly sealed, contribute a lot to heat loss and heat gain due to infiltration. And so this is important to consider the potential for air source heat pumps, basically, to tighten building envelopes by replacing these these leaking cooling systems. And then, as we said earlier, to electrify heating and hot water loads to take advantage of a greening grid, which is something that we expect to happen through state and other policies. And so now we have a team in this office working on ways to support the market for air source heat pumps in New York City. We're engaging also with our utilities to understand the impacts of beneficial electrification on our grid and on our gas distribution assets to ensure that this shift to electrified heating and hot water doesn't cause some unintended impacts on the grid. So now let's look at the recommended retrofits from our energy audits in our largest buildings. So an analysis of the ECMs here is basically a view as to what the typical savings might be for across typologies. So in this instance, a pre-war residential building under 7 stories is likely to see more gains from their recommended ECMs than those found in a very large commercial building. Now looking at all of these ECMs grouped together, what we found is that if each of these ECMs were pursued, we would yield only a 33% reduction in energy consumption, which is not nothing for sure, but is not enough to get the reduction we'll need to meet 80 by 50. So these recommendations by our auditors are not really extensive enough to reach these climate goals. Here's another view by building use type. And this understanding has led us to the development of something we call the high performance retrofit track of the accelerator program. This program enrolls building owners to pursue high performance retrofits, which include upgrades to all their major systems, including upgrades to heating, cooling, building envelope in a more holistic way. We expect that these retrofits are going to achieve 40 to 60% energy savings, so significantly higher than the 33% we expected we expect from our existing ECMs. And we'll bring these buildings down to a source EUI, a whole building source EUI of 60 to 80 kBTU per square foot. And so this program focuses on helping building owners achieve these through training, education, financing, and other measures. So while we've certainly considered all the voluntary measures we can, there's also, I think, an understanding or a conclusion here that the 80 by 50 challenge is quite a large one. It's massive, essentially, and that we will need to consider mandates to reach this goal. About a year or a little less than a year ago, the city introduced a building energy mandate for 2030, which would require mid-sized buildings and larger, so 25,000 and up, to meet a performance threshold of energy efficiency. And so I'm including this primarily because all of the work that went into developing that policy was supported by benchmarking, audit, and Pluto data sets at its core. This allowed us to model the expected impacts and costs of greenhouse gas emissions, the costs and savings of the retrofits that we expect would be implemented to reach this threshold. Also the air quality and public health benefits, the impacts on affordable housing and job creation. Those were supplemented by other data sets, including rent stabilization data, federal input-output modeling for employment calculations, and then also feedback from professionals in the field. So we're continuing to support this bill, and the data has been really critical in shaping it, and I think it's going to be critical in implementing if we get to that point. So I just wanted to wrap up and say, basically building data is really critical to everything we're doing here, whether it be from benchmarking, auditing, laws, our inventory, our tax lot use data. We can't do our analysis. We can't shape these policies without this. And so I just want to leave on that point that this data is critical to our progress. And that's it for me. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Ross. I think you all can see that New York City is doing some really groundbreaking work in how they're pulling data together from all these different sources and gaining some really interesting insights into how the building's performing and what can be done to help the building stock do better in the future. So thanks for sharing that. Let's switch over to our final speaker now. So Matt, can we get your presentation up as well? Perfect.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. Try to plow through here quickly for all of us. Greenlink has done this kind of work where we're trying to understand what the impacts of different benchmarking and transparency policies are going to be for a couple dozen cities across the United States right now. And so I'm going to try to focus on the benefits that will come beyond energy. So, efficiency is typically the target of these benchmarking and transparency policies, but it's not the only benefit. There's quite a bit more that can come of these policies if they are leveraged correctly. And some of these will come anyway, and they'll be a better part of telling the story. So one thing that we've been able to do is to try to address some equity issues. Currently, this is looking at the city of Atlanta. So we mapped the energy burden. So for those of you not familiar with that, that's the percent of your income that goes towards paying an energy bill. So these are actually just the electricity data points here, but this is for every zip code in the city of Atlanta. We've got a few zip codes that pay 2 to 4 times the national average in Atlanta. And we've got 350,000 people that currently live within an energy burden zip code. And so what we identified using some of the information that's available from things like benchmarking that we would get back from, say, the multifamily housing benchmarking reports. We identified a series of measures that could go forward to reduce the number of people living in energy burden to less than 50,000. So we could take almost all of the folks that are currently living in one of the darker red and orange zip codes and bring them into the green. We can make that a better result, and as a result improve equity throughout the city of Atlanta. Another area that we can look is trying to build a healthier city. And so we did some work on the benchmarking and transparency policy that's been adopted in Kansas City. They adopted this a few years ago. As a result of seeing energy savings, you have emissions that decline. And so because the emissions decline, your public health improves. And so what we were projecting in this case was that cumulative benefits would grow to be $183 million through 2030. Much of that coming from NOx and SO2, which are common pollutants that result in things like smog and cause asthma, heart attacks, etc. And so there's a reduction in those events. And through the right kind of modeling, it's possible to monetize the benefits that come from those emissions reductions. And so that's what we did with Kansas City here and pulled together the total set of benefits for them that will come from their energy savings after accounting for expected changes in their electricity mix. Another example is trying to show a wealthier city that can come out of these programs. So in general, energy efficiency is more labor intensive than electricity generation, or than the delivery of natural gas or fuel oil as well. And so we built out a model that was specific to this Midwestern city we looked at. So building an input-output model of the economy, and took a look at what kind of jobs would be created. So both the kinds of jobs and then how many of them. And so here we're seeing the aggregate. This is the total number of jobs that would be created by this policy. Some of the savings that you expect to see from things like benchmarking and transparency are the result of behavioral improvements, but a lot of the opportunity and the savings are going to result from investments made after benchmarking and transparency makes building owners aware of an opportunity within their building. And so that's going to require certain specialists to come and install the equipment, to make the adjustments that are needed, and that's going to deliver the energy savings to these commercial buildings. In most cities that we've worked with, we see typically 2 to 3 times more jobs coming out of an investment in energy efficiency than you would get from just continuing to pay a utility bill. However, as you get the savings continue to deliver over time, that does start to eat into some of the utility jobs, which is why you get some of this drop off in the later years. And so what that suggested is that the city is probably going to have to do more than just benchmarking and transparency in order to spur a green jobs revolution in that city. But it certainly helps, and it can jumpstart things. Another potential here is to build a more resilient city. And so you've got a reduction in emissions of CO2 in one case, and in water savings in the other. So in one of the Western cities that we've worked with, we've got a couple of projections here showing the CO2 emissions from their large large commercial buildings and their large multifamily buildings, and where those are projected to go, again, accounting for changes in their electricity grid mix over time. So that's kind of why it's bumpy, is there certain plants coming on or offline. But overall, this was looking at an opportunity to save nearly 50 tons of CO2 for the optimistic side, and about a little over 30 in the delayed implementation scenario. Overall, that's a 12 to 14% reduction compared to the 2014 levels, which is where some of the targets have been placed for that particular city. Another area that is certainly of interest in many cities is around water. May have seen some of what's gone on in Cape Town. Other cities go through periodic droughts that they're not always the best prepared for. So the ability to reduce the amount of water that's going towards power generation presents an opportunity to bolster water resilience and to preserve water resources in the watersheds that are supporting cities. And so in the case of Orlando here, we were looking at an opportunity to avoid takings of over 4 billion gallons by the power sector due to the energy savings that would be driven by the benchmarking and transparency policy in that city. So as a conclusion, there are many co-benefits that come along with benchmarking and transparency policy. I mean, I think the one that's a major driver for most of the building owners that participate in this kind of thing, aside from compliance, are the cost savings. There's an opportunity to see things like what we saw from the other two cities that presented here, getting quick paybacks and being able to promote that. But we also have the ability to improve energy equity outcomes, to save millions in public health expenditures, to add jobs to the economy, cut CO2 emissions, and save water, kind of all at the same time with this policy. So it's really just figuring out which of those we want to focus on and how to promote those. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Matt. That was an excellent presentation. So we unfortunately just have a couple of minutes left here. We will try to respond to all the questions via email if we don't get to them today. And as I mentioned, you'll be getting a link shortly, or an email with a link to the recording, to the slide decks. I guess I'll just end with one quick question to kind of tie things together. So this is for Ross and Katie, based on some of the stuff that that Matt was just presenting. I know your cities have typically focused on the energy savings and those opportunities. That's the easiest data to collect. But are there other co-benefits that you're hearing from stakeholders, from your citizens, or from your electeds that you also think are particularly important in your own cities, and that you're hoping that benchmarking will help achieve certain goals that go beyond just the energy savings? So curious if you have any perspectives on that.
Yeah, I can offer a few. From the building energy mandate, that proposal, we anticipate some pretty significant air quality improvements, because this mandate in its earliest form was focused around on-site combustion of fossil fuels, which basically is local emissions of not just greenhouse gas emissions, but other criteria pollutants. And so we had some help from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene here to model the number of lives saved and the impact on like asthma rates. And I think that that's a compelling kind of supporting component on that bill.
Great, thanks, Ross.
Hey, Jason, this is Katie. My phone was a little wacky and I missed the entire question that you asked. Could you just restate it?
Curious. Yeah, I was just kind of curious from your perspective, based on what Matt was just talking about, some of the co-benefits. Are there particular aspects beyond energy savings that DC considers to be important, that you're hearing input from your stakeholders and things that the city would like to achieve for other goals beyond saving energy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with some of the air quality benefits. I don't know of any specific studies that somebody has done with our benchmarking data in regards to that, but I know that we've had our air quality folks here in DOE reach out to us for some data because they're looking to try and figure out some of the systems that might be in some of the buildings in terms of fuel oil and things like that. So that's one thing that I know that we're kind of looking at. So yeah, air quality and definitely cost analysis. Those things are big here, I think.
Great, thank you. And with that, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. Apologies for those of you if we couldn't get to your questions, but we'll follow up with those separately. And I really want to thank all three of our speakers today for your presentations today. Really great information, great to see all the progress being made in this area. So thank you all for joining us today. And if you are interested in the next utility-oriented webinar we have coming up in a few weeks, please make sure you register for that one as well. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again. Bye-bye now.